How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Today on the Culture Architects Show, we are joined by Tim Spiker. Tim is a leadership advisor, founder of the consulting organization, The Aperio, and he's also the author of an interesting book that I recently read called The Only Leaders Worth Following: Why Some Leaders Succeed, Others Fail, and How the Quality of Our Lives Hangs in the Balance. The book is guided by the principle of who, not what, which Tim describes as kind of a data-driven, he calls it accidentally discovered, and we'll talk more about that, and rarely leveraged truth within leadership. We'll be updating this and other ideas from the book in a while, and it'll be interesting to see how Tim's work and research fit with the way that we talk about culture and leadership. So Tim, welcome to the Culture Architects podcast.
Thank you, David. Really excited to be here with you and to get a chance to visit with your audience.
Great. And my audience knows that, one of the things that I talk about all the time is I say that in my experience, the single most important ingredient in the success of any culture initiative, in my experience, is what I call CEO sponsorship. It starts at the top. You don't have a CEO that's saying this is important to us, we're not going to get very far. It doesn't get pushed up from below. And so I'm particularly interested that, the angle that you take on this, since you work so much on leadership and creating great leaders, you can't have great culture if you don't have great leaders. So we're going to dig deep into the leadership part. So let's start with the whole title of your book. Give us a little background, Tim, as to how did you come to the leadership space and write this book? Give us a little background.
Well, my entrance into the leadership space in general was maybe I've got multiple happy accidents in my life, but I had been, the best way to say it is I was duped. I was waiting tables, getting ready to start grad school, and one of my fellow servers invited me to an open house for a marketing company. And marketing was going to be something I wanted to dig into, and I was pretty sure there'd be a free meal involved, so I was there. Once I got there, however, though, I discovered about 5 minutes in that it was actually a recruiting meeting for a network marketing organization. And I was not interested in selling water purifiers to my family and friends. But I didn't want to make a scene, so I was going to wait for the break. And as I waited for the break, they started to talk about, what does it mean to be an employee? What does it mean to follow somebody? And it was such a negative room at that point. And I just checked out of the rest of the meeting. I didn't hear another word. It was kind of like Charlie Brown's teacher up there. And I just thought, why is it that way? And in that moment, the word that came to mind was leadership. And I walked out of that meeting that night saying, I'm going to go study whatever I can, talk to whomever I can. I want to learn more about leadership because it sounds like it could be way better than it is. So that's what launched me on the journey of working in this industry.
And so tell me about how you decided to write this book, or why you decided to write this book.
Yeah, the why is I couldn't not. Once I saw the data, once I saw the research, and I'm an engineer by education. I joke with people that the world is a safer place because I'm not a practicing engineer, and that's not actually a joke. That's true. But with that background, I love data. I love research. I love statistics. I love graphs. I love charts. I love all of it. And as I started working with a leadership consulting firm, we accidentally stumbled onto some data that pointed to something that it's kind of like one of those things that you can't unsee. And so for years I sat with it. It just sat inside of me, and you're kind of building a book, even though you're not yet writing it down or typing it up, and finally came to a spot where I couldn't hold off any longer. And so finally got it down into paper, started using it with our clients, which actually made it better and better because now we're really putting it into application, and we've got story after story from our clients. And then finally, I just had it as a PDF with my clients for 5 years. Wow. And everybody was like, Tim, come on. Can we please finally? And so finally I got across the finish line and actually got it into book form. So
nice. Yeah. And so you talk about this who, not what concept. And having read the book, I understand. But for our audience sake, describe the essence of this concept of the who and not the what, and where that comes from.
Yeah. So essentially, we were doing a series of assessments at my old consulting firm, bringing people up to the west side of Pikes Peak for a week at a time. And one of those assessments was a Leadership 360. It was one that we had built internally with the organization. And we were looking for connections between personality, natural ability, and leadership performance. And when we ran the statistical analysis, we found that there were no correlations at all, which surprised us. Mm-hmm. But at least then I could go back to our clients who would ask us, what's the magic mix? And we could just say there isn't one. There's not a magic mix. But in the midst of doing that research, my colleague Vanessa Kiley, in an act of desperation, just said to SPSS, please go find any correlation you can. And that statistical software came back and said, you're looking in the wrong places. There isn't a connection between personality and leadership performance. There isn't a connection between natural abilities and leadership performance. But if you'll just look within your own Leadership 360, you'll find that you're measuring 8 areas. 2 of them are driving 77% of the variability in this assessment, which means that 2 of them are more important than the other 6 combined. We had this data. I'll save us all 3 years because that's how long it took for the light bulb to come on for me. And after I share this, it might be a little embarrassing that it took 3 years, but it is what it is. But I was looking at my whiteboard one day and it just landed on me like a ton of bricks that those 2 areas that were responsible for 77% of the variability on that leadership assessment, they were different than the other 6. The other 6 were about what leaders do. Those 2 were about who leaders are. And that's when it just arrested me. I remember the moment when it happened and I was like, oh my goodness, who you are is 3/4 of leadership. And ever since that landed on me, I've been pursuing it to help people see it, to help people understand it, and to help leverage it.
And so clearly, it resonates. It makes sense. And as you point out in the book, and I'm sure in all your talks, that it's, I'm going to say intuitively obvious, and I don't mean that in a negative kind of way, but it's intuitively obvious that when we think about the leaders that we want to follow, we usually think about the people that we say, I admire that man or woman. They're good people. Yeah. And yet there's always a debate about how much people can change. Are we who we are, or are there things we can change? And obviously you must have a perspective on that since you're teaching people to try to change. Tell me more about what can we change and what can't we change?
Yeah. Well, this is the number one question that we get, which is really interesting to me because we don't get pushback on what the data says. Yeah. I've never had anybody directly come at me and say, no, this is a load of garbage. It's not happened. Maybe someday it will, but it hasn't happened yet. But this question of how much can we change, especially as we get along later in life. And there are many things, including research, that point to the reality that we can grow and develop. So specifically, I will point to Cheryl Aumann and Theo Dawson's work, as they were leveraging off of Lawrence Kohlberg's work around the development of the inner core of who we are. And in their longitudinal study over 13 years, they measured people's ability to grow at the core of who they are in terms of their moral reasoning. And they found that no matter what age you are capable, statistically speaking, of growing and developing in those areas. Really interesting. They found that nobody reached the top levels of moral reasoning and development under the age of 35. So, and if you think about, okay, wait, maybe that means we need a little time in the saddle to really grow in the depth of who we are. I think the misunderstanding around can we change over time is really, it goes back to Piaget and the idea of formative years. His work has become so ubiquitous, we don't even cite it anymore. We just use the term formative years and we don't even say who came up with it because we just all accept it as gospel truth. And in where he did his research, it is gospel truth. It is accurate. The problem is he was measuring folks earlier in life. He didn't do a longitudinal study that took people into much later on in their life. And so the idea of formative years is so profound. We see it so much in ourselves. We see it so much in our kids that we come to this logical but erroneous conclusion that we can't grow and develop past the age of 30. Now, I will admit, and maybe something that we've all experienced, it is harder later in life.
Sure.
It is harder, and let's put that on the table. But something being hard is different than it being impossible.
Sure.
And so,
yeah. And one of the things that I talk about often, Tim, as it relates to culture is I'm telling people that you should, for the most part, be trying to hire people who are going to be a good fit for the culture you're trying to build, because you're not likely to take many of the people who aren't a good fit and somehow magically change them.
Yeah.
But what I hear you saying, perhaps, and correct me if you're seeing this differently, maybe the way you would probably say this, I'm guessing, is yes, they can change, but it's going to be really hard for some of them. And I would say, to some extent, how much effort do I want to put into it? I'd be a lot better off finding people that are, generally speaking, already aligned around our culture.
Well, yeah, what we
have those people improve too.
Yeah. Well, what we would want in any of our organizations is to find the best and help them get better.
Right.
And as that pertains to alignment with our culture or leadership capabilities, that's what we would hope for. Can you take somebody that's running full speed in the opposite direction and turn them around to run full speed in the other direction? That's pretty difficult to do.
Right.
But the idea of how can we enhance? How can we help people get better? And the idea that doing that, especially at the highest levels of organization where you've got the most leverage and the most influence, hey, look, a 5 to 10% improvement in the quality of who you are as a human being is going to be multiplied by the scope and breadth of your influence. Yeah. And we see that throughout life everywhere. So we don't need to take a 180-degree turn with a leader in order to make a huge difference in an organization.
Makes sense. So let's go deeper on this, these two areas of who somebody is. And in your book, you talk about the aspects of being inwardly sound and outwardly focused. So let's break those two. Let's look at those individually. Let's start with inwardly sound. And just for our audience's sake, give me a brief description of what does that really mean?
Probably the best way to describe inwardly sound is with an analogy. And I want you to think of a boat, a vessel that's headed out to sea. And I want you to think, how sound is that vessel? Can it take a beating from the wind and the waves? Is it seaworthy? Is it something you can count on? Does the structure of it have integrity such that you know that no matter what comes at it, it's going to be held together? Just take that same idea now and apply it to a person. Somebody who is so solid and grounded in who they are that no matter what gets thrown at them, they're not going to crack or break or end up in a ball in the corner. And even that, I say that people can go through seasons. Some of us have had moments where 10 years ago, I was a ball in the corner. But today I'm a more well-developed human being. And so I can take the punches today better than I could a decade ago. So the idea of being inwardly sound is at its very base level, this is somebody who I can count on in any circumstance. And those are the type of people that we tend to trust more because we know they're not going to be wrestling with their own demons while they're trying to lead us as much. And that gives us confidence in them as leaders.
Yeah. I think about that in the context of parenting and everything else that we do, that I think we bring to the world whoever we are with.
Yes.
Either we're inwardly sound, to use your phrase, or we're some variation of that. And people bring their own, whether you call them demons, shortcomings, insecurities.
Yes.
All of that they bring to whatever they do in their life, whether it's how they are as a parent, how they are as a teacher, how they are as a leader. You bring who you are, and the more solid you are, the better you're going to do in almost anything you're doing.
Yeah. You mentioned the word insecurity, David, and it is, my goodness, if I could eradicate one thing on planet Earth, that might be it. The disease of insecurity, the impact of insecurity, it's incalculable. The things that we do completely unconscious that we're doing them because of our insecurities. It is just such an incredible, depressing force on the quality and efficiency. I mean, I've seen this in organizations where entire departments are being rallied not to execute the plan, but to assuage the insecurities of the leader of that department. And it is such a waste of time and energy, and it's so off from what the organization's up to. I've seen entire departments go in that direction. So insecurity is a big one. And look, let me say this. We all have insecurities. I'm not talking about, that we become Superman or Superwoman here and we never have a moment. If you look across the world, I think there are two kinds of people with insecurities and people with massive insecurities. I think we want to just do our level best to stay out of the massive insecurities space. It's not as if we'll be perfectly confident at all times, but how do we not let our insecurities drive the car in our lives is a really important part of leadership.
Yeah. And I think what you just said there is really critical, Tim, that, not letting it drive the car. So we all have our shortcomings, but do we allow those to drive our decision making? We talk about one of the fundamentals we talk about in many of our clients. It's one of our own. We call it check the ego at the door. And I often say when teaching that, it's not that we don't have any ego. We all do. It's that we don't let ego drive our decision making. We make decisions for what's good for the organization, not what will serve my ego.
Yeah,
and I think you're saying the same thing there. It's, we're going to have insecurities or whatever, but we're not letting our insecurities drive the decision making. What drives the decision making is what's best for the team. What's going to help this organization or department or whatever to be more successful.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
So we've got these two aspects. We've got the being inwardly sound and talk about the outwardly focused.
So you've set us up a little bit for a really great teaching with that terminology. And it's something that happens quite often. So I want to shift your language just a little bit from outwardly focused to others focused.
Others focused. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes. So
and the term had a good point about that in the book.
Well, and that's what I'm saying.
Distinction.
You've set us up well here. I had a friend, Steve Wilson, as I was writing the book, he said, you should really change it to outwardly focused. And I totally get it because it's a nice yin yang, right? Inwardly sound, outwardly focused. It makes sense, except for it creates an opening for us to misunderstand what it means. Years after this research came out, I had a chance to read an article by somebody who was citing the research. And as I read the article, I got depressed, honestly, because it took the whole idea in a totally different direction. It used this idea, it changed others' focus to be outwardly focused. And it was essentially an article about marketing and listening to your clients. Now, there's no question that we should all listen to our clients in a business environment. Of course, that's good, sound principle, voice of the customer, all of that we should actually do. But within that article, what you saw, what totally got eliminated was the personal relationships with people and the idea of being focused on them. It was kind of, how do I get information from them in order to make our company better? But it wasn't about leading anybody. It was also kind of a bastardization of the word leadership as well on top of that. But I share that story to say we're much more challenged to be others focused than we are by the term being outwardly focused. We can spend $100 million on a marketing campaign to be outwardly focused, but that doesn't mean that I'm knee to knee with other people, caring about them in the midst of their development and their lives. And that's really what being others focused is about. It's about digging in knee to knee, eyeball to eyeball with other people and seeing them for who they are and caring for them as leaders. And so that was a good, whether you maybe didn't mean to do it, but that was a good setup, David, because others focus really is about others.
Yeah. So there was, as you broke down in the book, that there's a section where for each of those two, being others focused and being inwardly sound, you described some of the attributes, behaviors that are elements of each of those. And then you have one that crosses in both of them.
Yes.
Talk more about that.
Yeah. Emotional maturity is the one that has a foot in both of those worlds, because emotional maturity has to deal with not only how we're recognizing and engaging with others' emotions, but maybe even first as a foundational, how we're recognizing and engaging with our own emotions. And so that emotional governor, if you will. And so many times when we think about emotional maturity, we think about, not blowing up in tense situations and things like that. And look, that's fair. People have done the whole career limiting move piece because they didn't manage themselves in moments. But I find interesting a lot of other stories about having emotion where it needs to be present and should be present. I think of a story about a leader that I was close to and knew about, and decided in the midst of turmoil that his move very naturally was going to be essentially stoicism, which at a certain level, I think his goal was to provide stability in the midst of challenge. The problem is he was the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz. He was so non-emotive and non-acknowledging and just kind of carrying on. It's just imagine the whole thing falling down and somebody standing in the middle of it saying, I don't see anything. That's essentially what we felt as followers in that season. And so what I would call lack of emotional maturity on his part disconnected him from us. What we needed from him was more emotion. Not that he needed to be screaming and yelling, but we needed to see that he understood that this was hard, that challenging things were going on. So emotional maturity is not just about how we see, understand, and engage with the emotions of others, but it has a lot to do with how we are engaging with our own emotions as well.
Yeah. Folks, that brings us to the end of the first part of my conversation with Tim Spiker, leadership advisor, founder of the Aperio, and author of The Only Leaders Worth Following. When we return in the next episode, Tim and I are going to pick up where we left off here on the two most important areas of effective leadership. That's what Tim calls being inwardly sound and others focused. I know you're going to want to hear where our conversation goes, so stay tuned.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.